I'm Kay Kreider, and I am with Stewardship for Us, and we are a preferred provider for stewardship services for UUA congregations. We do things like annual budget drives, capital campaigns, strategic planning, financial feasibility studies, and mission and vision work. And our group, all the people that are in Stewardship for Us, were all part of Wayne Clark's team at the UUA before he retired. And with me tonight, I have Reverend Jan Christian.
I'm Jan Christian, and I'm on Congregational Life staff just since July. In June, I ended 13 years of parish ministry in our congregation in Ventura, and stewardship is part of my portfolio in the Pacific Western region.
Generosity is an opportunity to make real our connection to others and to that which is larger than ourselves. Generosity is one of the important ways we participate in the spirit of life. And that's from Reverend Thomas Disrud. We think about generosity and stewardship sometimes together. And generosity is a core value for all areas of congregational life. And financial stewardship is just one piece of the larger commitment to generosity. So stewardship efforts to be successful, as I'm sure many of you know, are part of the overall commitment to generosity. And if we equate generosity only with financial giving, then we're really undermining our larger work and the values that are key to building beloved community together. So today we're going to focus on 5 different ways, other than financial gifts, to infuse generosity into our congregations.
When we think of the fruits of generosity, it's hard for me to think of anything positive that doesn't spring at some point from generosity. Trust certainly comes from generosity. It's one of the fruits of generosity. Kindness and compassion. A sense of abundance is one of the fruits of generosity. Enhanced well-being is another. And I'm wondering if there are other fruits of generosity that you would like to lift up tonight, things that you have seen spring from generosity. And I also want to point out, while people are having an opportunity to do that, often when we speak of generosity, we talk about giving. And I'm fond of saying that half of generosity is the ability to receive. And it is in this fine give and take of giving and receiving that constitutes generosity and helps create beloved community. And it's what makes our interdependence a joy instead of a sorrow.
And I see that Sonia says, as one of the fruits of generosity, openness and inquiry. Excellent.
I like that. A holy curiosity. Oh, and I'm seeing also that listening has come up, which I think is probably going to be a great segue into one of our pieces. They're already far ahead of us, but I knew that would happen.
That's right. All right, so generous praise and gratitude is one of the 5 ways that we're going to focus on tonight. Acknowledging the good that you already have in your life is the foundation for all abundance. So generous praise and gratitude is an important thing to focus on in terms of all the different areas of our congregation. We have so many people who are part of a team or a task force or a committee that provides service to our congregations to help us live out our mission and our vision. And it's essential for us to tell those folks how much we appreciate all the efforts that they're putting in. Their work is really essential to the church as a whole and to all the individual members and friends of the church and those in the wider community that are benefiting from all the volunteer service work. So think of the last time that you told a committee member or a lay leader or a staff member at your church that you are thankful for their talent and time? And do you express gratitude to them as often as you would like? And do you receive gratitude as often as you would like? Another piece of, aside from everyone who's on a team or a task force, is our lay leadership. And that can be the board of directors or the team leaders, people who are giving their time and their service in leadership roles in the congregation. And the third piece is for the staff, the minister or ministers, the music directors, the administrators, the lifespan religious educators, all the different pieces of staff that are out there. These are all the components that we can, these are all the people at the congregations that we can express our praise and gratitude to. So whether we're on the giving end or the receiving end, there's actually scientific research to show that gratitude makes us happier, more content, more spiritual, and more optimistic, to name just a few of the benefits that they've identified. Which leads us to ways that we can show praise and gratitude. The first item listed is be quick to praise and slow to criticize. It may seem obvious to give praise in this way, but sometimes we can get caught in a cycle of negativity and criticism. When something isn't going as planned, before giving any criticism, identify what's going well. Think about what the strengths are in the person or people that you're dealing with, as well as the strengths in ourselves. The appreciation, when you focus on that rather than the criticism and the negativity, builds positive connections and it builds confidence in the process. We all have different strengths and we all have areas where we could use improvement. And so this generous praise and gratitude in the framework of appreciation is very important. So if we're going to frame things in an appreciative way, an example would be, what was great about this process? What worked well? And praise that, rather than asking, what was bad about this process? You can build on what was good about the process, and not to say that you're going to ignore what was bad about the process, because you may need to discuss that as well. But when you focus on what was great about it, you can move forward and build upon that rather than getting stuck in the negative context. So how we frame our questions impacts the tone of our interactions with each other. So if we are going to reflect on praise and gratitude in each of our congregations, how does your congregation foster a culture of praise and gratitude? When or where does that happen? What is the context or the event or the activity?
In Ventura, our nominating committee and nominating and leadership committee began at their meetings coming with cards that they had already made out to lay leaders, and they would all sign it. And they started a column in the newsletter to highlight different lay leaders and why they were volunteering, what they got out of it. And so people could, also get to know a little bit more some of the volunteers in the congregation. And their first effort was focused on the people behind the scenes, the kind of people that you really don't know sometimes are volunteering, people who are making the coffee, making sure things go right behind the scenes, newsletter editors, people who are folding the newsletter for those that get written copies, the kinds of things that we all notice when they go wrong, but we don't always notice when they go right. There was a real focus on that.
So in what area would you like to see more praise and gratitude happening at your congregation? And what would that look like? In my own congregation, and I'm a member of a congregation like all of you, I would love to see more volunteer appreciation than just what happens at the once a year. I love seeing who has been helping out uh, during the Volunteer Appreciation Sunday, but I would love to see a little bit more of that interspersed, maybe quarterly throughout the year.
And Sonia
So,
says, I would like to see the board reinforce other leaders with cards or some other praise. And one thing I'd like to see is that it's everybody's job to give thanks and praise, because I often would have people come and say that they wish, more announcements would be made during the church service or certain things. And there's nothing preventing anyone from entering into that activity. And I think it makes more sense and it's more powerful. And someone else has just written that the board sends written thank yous monthly for major as well as random service, acknowledge and worship periodically and annually, all staff, RE folks, all volunteers. I was recently working with a congregation that's ministry was in trouble and having difficulty, and board members went to a staff meeting just to let them know how much they appreciated them. And it really brought tears to the eyes of most staff to have their struggle in the process recognized.
gratitude is always multiplied when you give freely. It is an infinite source of contentment and prosperous energy. And we all know we could use more energy when we're doing all the service work that it takes to live out our mission and vision as a church.
The next piece we want to talk about is assumption of good faith. And the quote here is, the principle of acting in good faith is at the heart of all decent work. But I would really add that the principle of assuming good faith is also at the heart of beloved community and building the congregational culture we long for. And this image, you might have to move your chat over a little bit to see the full image, comes from Burning Man. And I just love the way that it captures, I think, what happens when we don't assume good faith and that we are separated from one another. And then also what happens when we operate from our best selves and assume that others do as well. If there's one cultural shift that could change our congregations and communities, I really think the assumption of good faith might be it. And I wonder how many of you have covenants of right relationship, and whether or not assuming good faith is part of that covenant. You're welcome to add that to the chat if you'd like. And we'll speak to the next slide, which talks about hallmarks of acting in good faith. How do we know when we're acting in good faith? And I think the first piece is we focus on our own intentions. And the second is we avoid negative assumptions about the intentions of others. Karen Armstrong, in her powerful work on compassion, talks about we really don't understand our own intentions, really, let alone the intentions of others. And we're more likely to give ourselves the benefit of the doubt than to give others the benefit of the doubt. And as I was thinking, because we had a staff member who checked in the other day and said, and we were talking about what do we need from one another, and one of them said, I need the benefit of the doubt. And I was thinking about relationships in my life that are not what I would like them to be, and it was sort of easy for me to think about people that I feel like haven't given me the benefit of the doubt and how it would change things if they did. And it was harder for me to think about the relationships that would change if I gave others the benefit of the doubt, but I could certainly do that as well. And so I wonder about benefit of the doubt and how that might resonate with you. Are there people in your life that you really long for the benefit of the doubt, or they may long for that from you. And it seems like assuming good faith or good intentions already positions us to reach out to one another and to be open to understanding. The third thing I think when we're acting in good faith is we allow ourselves to be vulnerable. Brene Brown has written so many beautiful things about this. Vulnerability begets vulnerability. I remember a woman in the congregation I served in Ventura saying, you know, I'm going to start acting with my daughter-in-law like I already have the relationship that I long for. And when she did that, she said things changed. She became more vulnerable. She assumed good intentions from her daughter-in-law, and things changed as a result. And I'm wondering if you can also think of ways in which the vulnerability of others has brought out the best in you. And surely we risk being hurt. But I think I've done more hurt in my own life to myself by trying to protect myself from hurt than I have from opening my heart. And I think of a case in our congregation in which we gave away a lot of money. We got to the point where we gave away every Sunday offering. It either went to our own in-reach outreach fund, which we gave away, or it went directly to other nonprofits. And every now and then we would be kind of taken in by the story of someone that people would think of as kind of a shyster and someone who was going to other places for money, and maybe their story didn't quite add up. And I loved it when lay leaders said, that's okay. We'd rather make that mistake. We'd rather give money to someone whose story might not be honest than to become overly suspicious and not give it when it's needed. And maybe our generosity with that person who wasn't being quite honest might have planted some seeds that will bear fruit at some point as well. The fourth thing I think about is examining our relationship to authority. And I don't know the extent to which this might resonate with some of you. It seems that often we assume good faith of some people in our congregation and sometimes not others. And that often in our Unitarian Universalist congregations, the place we don't assume good faith is from people in authority. And I think that this has a really chilling effect on our ability to recruit volunteers to be in leadership. And also that suspicion sometimes has a tendency to make our leaders grow defensive and feel like they have to play to the least healthy people in the congregation. And then they, in turn, I have seen sometimes our leaders don't assume good faith of the congregation back and tend not to be as collaborative as they might, or to practice transparency. And I'm wondering if that's a dynamic that you've seen in your congregation. And if so, I invite you to share experiences on the chat. And I do see from a previous question that Stevie Rayett wrote that we do have a covenant of right relationships for board, and it's redone each year. And Annie said, yes, sometimes leadership becomes a dirty word. And this, I think, can be a very sad reflection, and we sometimes take pride in how difficult it is to lead in our congregations. And I think this keeps us small, literally and figuratively at times. And so I'm hoping that maybe this will spark some good conversations in your congregations about trusting leadership, and particularly for those of you who've taken on the difficult job of stewardship, which already seems to be, there's like a mistrust there. And we know that in talking about financial giving, we hit a lot of people's woundedness in that process, and it can become very difficult. Connie Murray wrote sometimes people do not trust leadership when the leaders are dealing in confidential things like hiring and firing. I think that's a great point, and Connie is in our congregation in Monterey, and I talked a little bit about that during our startup this last weekend. That it's very hard sometimes for us to live in the not knowing, because we're curious people and we want to know, and sometimes it's not even legal for us to know, and it can go a long way. I think in sometimes even creating trustworthy behavior for us to let people know we have faith in them. And so I'm wondering, are there ways in which your congregation is intentional about assuming good faith? Do you use that language in your congregations? And whether or not you can think of ways in which you might become more intentional. I think a subtle way that we don't show faith in others sometimes is not trusting them to struggle with difficult things. And I think it can be very powerful to articulate the words that we do have faith in one another.
Yeah, and I think that and this may be true in other denominations as well, but I think that we're fairly independent minded as UUs. And so sometimes we do have trouble in terms of our assumption of good faith, because we want to be involved in the decision making. And so on the part of our leaders, we've elected them to do particular things. And even in instances where it might be legal to know, it's not particularly appropriate to share some information about a decision-making process. So transparency is important, but only when it's appropriate. And so thinking about how we can be more trusting in what is, as many of you probably know, the very hard work of the board of directors and the staff, and a lot of the decisions that they have to make can create a culture of good faith and generosity around that in our congregations. So moving on to the next category of generosity, we have attentive listening, and that came up just a little bit earlier in the chat. And there are many benefits to this process of listening. The first is that good listeners are created as people feel listened to. Listening is a reciprocal process. We become more attentive to others if they have attended to us. And this is Meg Wheatley, who's written a lot of fabulous things. So when we're thinking about attentive listening, people have a need to be heard and not necessarily a need to be agreed with. And along that same line, attentive listening doesn't necessarily involve attentive answering. So all of us have been tempted, and including myself, when we hear somebody who's expressing a concern or a problem or something that's on their mind, we want to provide them with a solution. And that's not necessarily a bad intention, but it's not necessarily what they need either. So keeping that in mind when we're listening to concerns, whether it's about money and financial stewardship, or whether it's about a hiring and a firing, or something else that's not going quite the way that we want in our congregation. Sometimes just listening is an important piece without the responding, other than maybe reflecting back to the speaker that you heard what they said and that you understand what they're saying. When we're thinking about attentive listening, what does that mean? Removing some distractions, eye contact when that's comfortable, listening to the speaker's signs that they have visually and their sounds. And again, feeding back to them that you've understood what they have said, but not necessarily that you have an opinion about it. So if you have a natural tendency, like I do, to rush to provide some sort of advice or response, take a deep breath and allow the other person to finish their thoughts, and then take some time yourself. Good communication in terms of this attentive listening could be sticking to the known facts rather than speculating, or getting clear, concise info in a timely manner, speaking in a voice that's welcoming and encouraging dialogue, practicing attentive listening and empathy. So this framework of attentive listening generates a positive atmosphere and consensus building, so that people know that even though we all aren't always going to have the same opinion on what should happen, that people know that they have been listened to and that their thoughts have been heard and that their opinion has been considered. So the benefits of one-on-one attentive listening are multifaceted. So, and one of the things, and we'll just take it back into the sort of traditional thoughts about stewardship, when we think about what the most effective ways to do an annual budget drive often are when you have one-on-one meetings. And why is that? You can build a deeper connection when there's either, one person and a couple, or just two people. You can get more in-depth information, and often it's easier for people to communicate in a smaller setting than in a group setting. We all have different personalities along the spectrum of introvert and extrovert and everything in between. We can develop more open relationships often when we're in a small one-on-one setting. And often it's easier for people to feel empathy and acceptance of the other person when you're in a one-on-one attentive listening conversation. So it's really the process of attentive listening is encouraging the speaker to share more information by giving them that space to do that in that one-on-one setting.
And Kay, I would say too, I know in some of the stewardship work I've seen, those listening circles around our issues around money, not even particularly, and I mean, I've seen it, how helpful it is to have people testify to how much the church means to them and what it's done for their family and that kind of thing. But to also have opportunities just to talk about the role of money in our lives and giving, and to be able to do that in a way in which it feels like we're being heard. I just think so much of the one-on-one listening throughout congregational life, but sometimes especially in stewardship, where we bring a lot of our own feelings of inadequacy and that kind of thing, can really be a way to move things along. And I think also for people involved in stewardship campaigns to be able to ask for the benefit of the doubt, to speak to their own vulnerability in taking on that kind of work, and how they could use the benefit of the doubt. I think that kind of listening to one another can really help when emotions are high.
Yeah, and I agree. And I've done a lot of stewardship visits in my own congregations that I've been part of, as well as helping other congregations. And I love the one-on-one connection that is really a different type of connection than you get when you're during coffee hour after the service. And I learn so many interesting things about people during these conversations, during the one-on-one, that connects me to them much more deeply than if I hadn't been on a visit. And if it's a stewardship visit, then sometimes there is an outcome of a pledge at the end, and sometimes there's not. And there's no judgment, there's no difference at the end. It builds more compassion, more empathy when you find out more about the person's individual circumstance when you're having that one-on-one conversation. So if we're going to reflect on attentive listening in our own congregations, what, do you and others in your congregation feel heard? And when or where has that occurred? What's the context or event or activity where you feel the most heard in your congregation? Do you feel like that there are instances where there's been conflict or a problem or a feeling of negativity if people don't feel heard? Annie says we will host forums where folks can speak their minds. That's great. So you have little cottage meetings or a town hall meeting or meetings where people can express their concerns. And Connie says change and transitions can be difficult, and that's such an excellent point.
Mm-hmm.
The capacity that each of us has to embrace change and the speed at which we all are able to embrace change varies widely.
Right.
So it's so important to keep that in mind when we are listening to the concern or the anxiety or something that's being expressed about what the change is, because some of us are able to say, oh, this, of course it's going to be better once we make this change. And then some of us are going to say, no, I really don't want that change. That's scary to me. And I want some more information about what that might look like. So especially if we're working on a committee and we've been really working hard on all the details and we're really immersed in it, sometimes we forget that other people in the congregation don't really have the level of detail that we have to know that the path that we're moving towards, this change, seems like the best option. And it can be frustrating if someone is bringing up their concerns, but knowing that they have an opportunity to share either in the forums or small group chalice circles or town hall meetings or whatever forum, the one-on-one meetings, can really do a lot to alleviate concerns and have people understand what the concerns of other people are around the change and the transition.
And I will be talking a little bit more about that also in more detail as we go on. I think it's so important. Yeah.
All right. So the next topic of the 5 is generous mentoring. And we have that famous philosopher, Steven Spielberg, here, who says the delicate balance of mentoring someone is not creating them in your own image, but giving them the opportunity to create themselves. So I love that quote because we all, when we're working hard at something, it's hard for us to let go of it when we're passing it on to somebody else because we feel like that the work we did on it is good and we want to preserve that. But part of creating new leaders or even just transitioning a particular task that you do on a team or a committee to someone else is giving them the opportunity to put their stamp on it, to put their mark on it. And so that's a piece of the mentoring. And we don't have a we're not all on video, so we can't raise our hand and say, but you can raise your hand where you are if you want, either metaphorically or physically, and say, was there a time that I wanted to put my mentoring stamp on the person that I was passing it to, or there was no one to pass it to? Mm-hmm. You've got a job that you've been doing, and you want to have a chair-elect to train and have them be able to put their stamp on it, but there's no one out there. So it's frustrating sometimes in our congregations where we feel like that people have to learn a process that somebody else in the congregation knows well, fresh from the start, because we're missing this mentoring piece. So,
well, I also think too that we can appeal to people's generosity in this area with people who have trouble letting go of positions or information because they associate that with, I guess, a certain power or status, or who are articulating that they're burnout and tired, I think we can appeal sometimes to people's sense of generosity in asking them to share that. And I think sometimes that can be a good strategy for sharing leadership.
And in terms of passing on our leadership skills and our knowledge, if we're on a committee or we're a leader of a team, what are some of the positive results that we see when we're mentoring the next person who's going to take over that role? So we're being inclusive, and that's an important piece of bringing in new people. Sometimes people feel confident taking on a new role, but oftentimes there's lots of very capable people in the congregation, but they might not actually know themselves that they're capable. So having a mentor be there to explain what the hoops are and how things go can be really important, and it's important for inclusion. And Connie says things can get done better by someone new, right? So that's great. And it might be hard for us to admit that, but that is so true. It's great. Things, they think of new things, they think of new ways to do things. It's more interesting for everybody. So it's great to do that, which gets us to this next piece, which is diversity, right? So having somebody new take it on is going to make it look a bit different. You're building confidence. Again, we see in our congregations that the same people are stepping up again and again into leadership roles, which is fabulous that people step into leadership roles. But there's a lot of people out there that could learn the skills on how to do that. And I'll tell you, there's one example of in my own life and in my own family where my husband was serving on the board of our congregation. And he said that he learned so many helpful things in that process. He had never been a board member, that helped him in his job when he was doing management of a lot of employees in a large setting. And so it was great for him to do that. And they asked him to come on the board, and he learned that. And he was able to carry that over into other aspects of his life. So there's continuity. That's another huge piece of this generous mentoring. So how many times have we heard after we've already kind of reinvented the wheel on the committee that, there was already a binder in one of the file cabinets that had all this stuff in it already. So, it can save a lot of time. And again, it doesn't have to be exactly as we would do it, but giving that continuity is part of also infusing the confidence into the person that they're not starting from scratch. And of course, being a mentor helps build connections, like a lot of these other pieces of generosity that we've been talking about this evening. And that leads to more community when you have this mentoring piece. And then of course, last but certainly not least, that this generous mentoring can prevent burnout. Again, we have sometimes people stepping up again and again into leadership roles, and we can branch out. We can get somebody new in the role, we can train them, and really be more inclusive, have more diversity, and build confidence in that new person. All right, so mentoring and recruiting, just a few words on that. Recruiting somebody to do something is always easier if there's a mentor. I'm going to help you through it. So I've been trying to recruit somebody, for example, to chair a capital campaign for a particular group. And they want some help. They want the manual. They want instruction on how to do that. And a manual is helpful, but part of my recruitment is that I am going to be there to mentor this person in their role to do that. So they ended up saying yes to that job. And a big piece of it was that they knew that they weren't going to be creating everything from scratch, that they had somebody there to help out. And then out there, the data shows us that aside from a best friend or a spouse, that mentors are the most successful in recruiting new people to do things. So again, if you have the skills to mentor somebody into a new role, or if somebody's trying to get you to take on a new role, you can say, gee, is there someone here who can mentor me in this process? So a reflection on mentoring is, how does your congregation handle changes in committee chairs, board, or other transitions? And think about that in the context of mentoring. Do you usually have someone who is going to be training the next committee chair? Do you have a chair-elect on some of your committees? What areas of your congregational life would you like mentors to develop? I would love to see mentors develop in the area of stewardship, of course. That's always an area where we sometimes have trouble recruiting. And so having a new person take it on and put their stamp on it is great, but if they have the previous chair who can help out, that's always a fabulous thing to be mentoring.
So now we're to something we already mentioned before. And I doubt that any of this is particularly new to anyone. I think our hope tonight is that we will see how these things might infuse stewardship, and how our stewardship efforts really need to be grounded in a larger picture of generosity. And I think it was Connie who mentioned earlier how difficult things are sometimes during transitions and change. And it's been said that it's not change we fear, it's loss. And how important it is for us to be generous with ourselves and one another during times of change. And I love these two quotes. Joseph Campbell's, "You have to strive every minute to get rid of the life that you have planned in order to have the life that's waiting to be yours. Move, move, move into the transcendent." That's the whole sense of adventure, I think. And then this other one by Osho, "Courage is a love affair with the unknown." Now, I'm a planner, and yet I think Joseph Campbell and Osho are really onto something here. And I love Joseph Campbell's story one time about a woman who came to him telling him all about the pilgrimage she was going to take and all the details of where she was going to go and what she was going to do and the meaning of it and that kind of thing. And she said to him, "Do you think it'll go according to plan?" And he said something like, "Madam, with any luck at all, it won't." And I think of how often with any luck at all, things won't go according to plan. And I often tell that to people when I'm doing weddings. All these carefully laid plans of how things are going to go, that it's when the fly lands on your nose during the vows, it's when something breaks down, when there's a rainstorm, and you have to move the venue, that's when we wake up. That's when we become present and open. And of course, change is going to happen anyway. So I think about generosity during change. And part of this is befriending the unknown, which is on our next slide, and being open to the possibilities. And acknowledging that some of our greatest gifts come from things we would never have chosen. What I find is that our imaginations are often limited. And when we fear the unknown, we're often closing our door to a better future. I think that the gifts we find out of the unexpected do not negate the tragedy, because sometimes it is the tragedy, but it seems that our religious work is to keep looking for that gift. And life is certainly very generous in giving us opportunities to learn about everything we need to learn. So what does it look like to be generous during change? I think one thing is to acknowledge our differences in assimilating change. And Kay already spoke to some of this, but I've seen even in chaplaincy in a hospital room, as people are gathered around someone who's dying, I see the difference in the way people are approaching that. And it doesn't mean that will always be the way they approach it, certainly. But some of us seem to be just kind of hardwired to be beginners. And some of us are hardwired to be people focused on endings. When we hear people saying, well, we just need to get through this and, we'll be stronger for it. That's a beginner type person. Or how will we ever go on? How could there ever be life after this? And that's someone who's focusing on the ending. And so I invite you to think about where you are in terms of a relationship to endings and beginnings. Are you someone who often downplays the importance of endings? Are you someone who gets focused on it and has a lot of trouble thinking of what's next? I think the generosity comes in realizing that we need both. Now, some of us can really balance both of those, and we're kind of enders and beginners, and we've grown a lot, and we've become better at navigating both and understanding how they're connected. But mostly, I would say we're kind of one or the other, or we resonate, first of all, with one or the other. And so I invite you to think about that. And I think in generosity, the way generosity has to do with this is that we realize we need each other. We need each other to listen and to honor that that's the way things are for us. And there may be many reasons why they are that way for us. But we also need one another because we need to be able to do a better job of endings in our culture. And that good endings make for good beginnings. And we need to be able to understand the importance of beginning again. And that in each moment is a new beginning. And when we can honor that both approaches are needed, I think then we're being generous with one another. And particularly when we see ministerial transitions, when we see transitions of staff, when we see deaths in our congregations, to name and honor both. And that everyone's in a different place, excuse me, at a different time. I think the other piece is creating space for failure. It's generous to create space for failure and to give people the courage to try. It's generous to say, it's okay. Not everything's going to be a success. In the southern region of our congregational life staff, they've coined the term experifail, which is giving them permission to be bold. Knowing that fear doesn't prevent failure, it prevents success. And that when we're willing to be vulnerable with one another and share our failures as well as our successes, it's also part of generosity. The next thing is to celebrate resilience. We wouldn't be here if we weren't resilient. So however stuck some people seem at times, however stuck we feel, we're resilient or we wouldn't still be here. And it's when the things feel like they're most falling apart it's a good time, I think, to show faith in one another's resilience. I love the story of Chuck Yeager breaking the sound barrier. And he said, the only reason I was successful when no one else was is because right before you break the sound barrier, it feels like the whole plane is coming apart. And we've lived through those times. And he said, every pilot before me backed off when it felt like things were falling apart. And the reason I broke the sound barrier is I kept going. So to be able to share the stories when it felt like things were falling apart, but they didn't, and we kept going. Knowing that sometimes things have to get worse to get better. That's a tough place to be in. I think the other thing we can do in generosity is we identify the things that don't change, the things we can count on. And I invite you to think about those things. What are some of those things in congregational life that we can count on, that continue? What are some of the things that we can count on in our own life during tough times? Sources of inspiration for me are always around. People who will help when I'm able to ask for help. Opportunities for growth. The other piece is for cultivating practices that will sustain us. And that's what congregations, it seems like, are for. To be able to say, yes, I understand this is difficult, we're having problems, and we will continue on. And we can do that together. There's a saying that the time to pack your parachute is before you jump out of the plane. So how do we create spiritual practices, and what are some of those? And I think an obvious one in our congregations that we can lift up is Sunday morning worship. It's the one thing that distinguishes our congregations from any other group, or it's the one thing that distinguishes religious communities from any other effort. So we come to generously embracing change and being generous with one another in that process. And I like this slide. The beginning is near. The end may be near, and the end may be upon us, but the beginning is also near, and it's next. The story is still being written, and we look ahead to the next chapter. And so I invite you, Dick Gilbert, my colleague Dick Gilbert, talks about life is always unfinished business, and that's the good news, because it means life is still to be written. There's not a period yet at the end of the sentence. We are part of the unfolding of the cosmos. We were here at the beginning, we'll always be here. And so I'm wondering if you have ideas about what you would like to name the next chapter in your life or your congregation's life. And I think the other piece is that we find ways, when we're generous with change, to celebrate the changes that mostly we feel like embracing. And there are a lot of new norms that have been created in our culture in our lifetime, and sometimes in time periods that we never thought were possible. And that we take time to celebrate the changes that have taken place, and that we've been part of. And we celebrate the changes that we have helped create, and be generous with ourselves in celebrating in our gratitude.
So when we're thinking about this a new norm of generosity, think what your congregation would be like if generosity was prevalent in all the different things that your congregation does. To recap a few that we've talked about tonight: generous praise and thanks, generous assumption of good faith, generous attentive listening, generous mentorship, and generous embracing of change. And when we think about these things, as Jan mentioned earlier, you probably heard some of this before, but for me and for Jan and for hopefully a lot of you, encapsulating it here and thinking about these items and reminding ourselves all the different ways that we can be generous apart from the financial stewardship is part of what we're trying to do as congregations. Lift each other up, listen well, help each other in their path forward through mentoring, and help us through change. What kind of feeling comes over you as you imagine a place where generosity is part of every aspect of your congregational life? Generosity is a state of mind that goes beyond the possession of money and material goods and relates to feelings of abundance from positive connections. To own an authentic sense of generosity is a gift that we give ourselves and others.
So good night, all. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And I agree, it's nice to look at faces. And it's been at least nice to read your contributions to the chat. I hope that you will give yourself the gift of generosity as you give it to others. And may you find ways of giving yourself to increase your ability to receive all the blessings in your life, as well as to bless the world in thought, word, and deed. Amen. Blessed be.
Amen.